Thank you, and most welcome to all of you. We have been looking forward to this, and we are very happy that so many will join us today. And I also want to welcome, of course, Dr. James Dorsey, who is with us from Singapore. And we would have loved to have James here, but for different reasons it was not possible. James, he wanted to come here also, but there were some challenges. Anyway, we make this, we learned during the lockdown called hybrid. So this is what we are going to have today. And let me start by introducing James. He is a senior fellow at the Ratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He has a long career. He has a long career as an academic, writing these fine peer-reviewed academic articles for journals, international journals. He also, a couple of years ago, published a very interesting book called China and the Middle East, which I certainly can recommend. And then he has been working as a correspondent for many of the famous magazines and newspapers in the world, and have traveled many places and met many leaders. So he is a very skilled person and a very with a very big knowledge about, especially what we could, with a little bit strange term called the Islamic world. And also, of course, with the developments that now with the changing world order, China as a rising power, and these kind of things. So we are very happy to have James here. Then we will have the pleasure of having some interventions by my good colleague, Yang Jiang, who is a senior researcher here at the Institute, and is a specialist and in China's political economy and foreign policy. And after this welcome, I will just briefly introduce the topic of today, yeah. Now I want to have my PowerPoint on the screen. Yes, thank you. Now we will have the opportunity to look at James 2 times because he will have 2 interventions. James is our key speaker today, I would say. But first, I will make this a short introduction to the issue, and we decided to call our seminar "Which World Order Does China Want?" We very often are listening to China as a rising threat, China as this and that. We have been familiar, at least since the end of the Cold War, with an agenda for a liberal United States-led world order, but not so often we have discussed what actually want China. And this is just an overview where I tried to present in some few points the difference between the world views of United States versus China when it comes to world order. They are agreeing on a rules-based world order, but they are disagreeing about what that would mean. Um, they are different approaches to how the world should be ruled. United States also in its latest national security strategy, which came out in October, a couple of weeks ago, arguing that they feel chosen to be the leader of the world. We talked very much about the unipolar world after the end of the Cold War, but quite quick we could talk about a unipolar moment, and I think the right term today would be that United States wants to be a leader in a multipolar world, promoting a liberal order and promoting democracy. China argues for a multilateral order, basically ordered through the United Nations. And they do not, or the Chinese do not talk about promoting a liberal order. Actually, I think that time has come to stop a liberal order, and they are not promoting democracy, but promoting sovereignty as a key concept for non-intervention in sovereign states, and thereby respecting territorial integration. For these points, they have, of course, not recognized Russia annexation of Crimea. They think they have ordered their own companies not to deal with what they call the occupation power in Crimea. So this is then there is the discussion, and we come back to that, about Taiwan, Hong Kong, and these things. But basically, China is having this conception that it is a part of one China. So this is what they want to provoke. United States is promoting regime change strategy, have been doing that since the as a strategy, at least since 2002, from the famous security strategy at that war. And that means that they have an idea of ethical or moral legitimation of doing war, as we have seen in, for instance, in Iraq in 2003, and otherwise. This is divergence from the tradition in Europe for many hundred years, who had, after the Westphalia Peace in 1648, a kind of non-interference, balance of power approach. But this was changed by the US after the end of the Cold War, and now we have a debate between different powers about what kind of strategy. One example is, of course, Syria, where United States want to get totally rid of the dictator, Bashar al-Assad, where a state like China recognize him as a legitimate leader of Syria. So this is a clear difference about these different approaches. United States is, as we see almost every day, building security by, of course, which is also a big part of the national security strategy, building up a strong military, of course, but then building on defense alliances and using sanction regimes. China is also building up its military and argues that security should be promoted through the United Nations and through multilateral partnership, which is not as the same as alliances, and they do not support sanction regimes. United States promotes security through containment strategies. Most famous containment strategies was towards the Soviet Union, but now they, as I will come back to shortly, containment strategy targeted at China. And security, I would say, is at least in the different discourses from China, promoted through connectivity. United States is promoting peace and stability by expanding democratization, talking a lot of now of building up an alliance of democracies, while China is promoting peace and stability by increasing development. They have what we have called a so-called root cause model, that is if people get more have better welfare, have better opportunity for work and income and housing and these kind of things, it will promote stability. And they are agreeing on promoting free trade, or at least have been until recently. How does United States see China? United States see China as a revisionist power, that is a power that is a rising power that want to take over the leadership of the world, or maybe even be a world dominant power. And China is, and it's written from, this is quotes from the National Security Strategy that came out a couple of weeks ago. And if you read it, it's clear that the argument from United States is that China is an authoritarian power that is violating principles in its near area, as well as promoting another kind of order than what United States is actually looking for. And how this is the picture. China is also going to be maybe world's biggest economy, and this is not in the interest of United States, and it's also a reason for United States to contain China. And what do they use to go against this development of a rising power? Yeah, they have used what they also used during the Cold War, the containment and deterrence strategies. Briefly, the AUKUS, military cooperation between Australia, Great Britain, and United States, including submarines and these kind of things. The Quad, another security and military strategic dialogue and cooperation here between Australia, India, Japan, and United States. Of course, the Five Eyes, the intelligence network that now is working together with an East Asia state like Japan, challenging still increasingly what's going the relations of the so-called one China policy in the Taiwan area. Freedom of navigation, where we have different navies from the west, one led by France, another by United States, of warship in the South China Seas areas, and then, as already mentioned, the alliances of democracy. So this is the approach to try to contain China and want to put a break of Chinese expansion. And I think this map is showing how containment is being built up with the bases and with the activities in the Indo-Pacific. And also we see how they want to build up new alliance partners, and China and the United States actually is both proposing to Kazakhstan and these things. So there's a rivalry going on there. How does China react to this? I think they have, as we know and have been discussing, I think they have two kinds of power projection strategies. One I call the hard power projection, and it is for the area close to China. It is what we know, Taiwan, Hong Kong. This is South China Sea, and this is all this is considered to be territorial China territorial areas, and they are sending the signal that they will aggressively, of course, defend these areas. Why? Maybe if we look at the map again, if we look down here, we have it is Malaysia, it's Brunei, it's Indonesia, but we have a strait there, and it's a Malacca Strait, and 40% of Chinese foreign goods are going through this, and of course it would be a catastrophe if it was totally blocked by a containment strategy. The other approach is what we call here a latent power projection. That is working together with other on doing kind of operation, peacekeeping operation, and other kinds of operations together. This have be seen in especially what I call the heartland, the Chinese heartland. It is the Persian Gulf into the Middle East, which is becoming still more important for China in its response to the US containment strategy. And they try to build up this by partnership and the Belt and Road Initiative, and through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which of course, not of course, but which was established as a response to the situation after the 9/11 terrorism and the initiation of the war on terror, the Afghanistan war on the border to China. So they established this forum, which is basically a forum of China, Russia, and Central Asian powers, now also from next year with Iran. And it is a forum for making discussion and cooperation and agreements about both security, but border security, counterterrorism activities, but also humanitarian activities like humanitarian aid to the people in Afghanistan, and different kind of thing. And it is not as it has been portrayed in the media somewhere a defense alliance. It is a forum that can develop different kinds of cooperations. And the reaction, of course, is this Belt and Road Initiative, which was announced in 2013, and I don't think it's I mean, it is announced 1 year after the famous Barack Obama Asia travel and announcement of what later became labeled as Pivot to Asia. And I think at that time they were becoming aware that there was this building up of a containment strategy. And if you look, if this is blocked here, and of course China will do much to avoid this, but as an alternative, they can build up the corridor westwards. And the most important thing is to get access to the high seas, because if that is blocked here, then there will be access here. And that is why I call the Persian Gulf and the Middle East for the heartland of China in the 21st century. Because this would be able give China an alternative to the sea route and access to the ocean here, and thereby to both Africa and up to Europe. The last years we have seen, and then I will stop here, we have seen a tendency to try to expand connectivity roads and rails that are bypassing, so to say, Russia, to have also alternatives here. So this, I think, with these introductory remarks, I will, leave it there. Yeah, I think I have said what it was intended, and then I will kindly give the word to James from Singapore.
Lars, thank you very much for that generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. I wish I could have joined in person, but hopefully next time better. You've perfectly framed what I would like to do, which is essentially move away from principles and generics and look at what China wants and what China does from the ground upwards. With other words, what's happening in terms of policy and reality on the ground. I would start by arguing that US President Joe Biden potentially made a strategic mistake when he framed the struggle for Ukraine as a battle between democracy and autocracy. In doing so, he did America's main rival, China, an unintended favor. Fact of the matter is that Ukraine is not about democracy versus autocracy, and that may be a good thing. Ukraine is about adherence to international law versus a world order based on civilizationalist rather than nation states, in which might is right and the law of the jungle rules. The framing of democracy versus autocracy can be easily dismissed by leaders like China's Xi Jinping, who proudly tout the virtues of their autocratic rule. However, the framing of rule of law and adherence to international law puts in a bind civilizationalist leaders like Xi, who, in line with Russian President Vladimir Putin, define their country's borders in civilizational rather than national terms, while simultaneously paying lip service to international law. These leaders see their external and or internal borders not as defined by internationally recognized frontiers, but by civilizational reach. In Russia's case, Russian-speaking populations and adherents to Russian culture constitute the Russian world and mark its borders. In China, civilizationalism constitutes the framework for conflicts in the South and East China Seas and governs Chinese attitudes towards ethnic Chinese communities across the globe. In many ways, China follows the path of the United States, using trade, investment, infrastructure financing, and lending to countries across the global South as its main tools in shaping the policies of other countries in its mold. China was long successful in promoting the perception that its economic statecraft involves no strings, in contrast to the United States, with its conditionality involving human rights and environmental considerations. The perception ignores the fact that Chinese support is often designed to reward compliant political constituencies in benefiting countries, while enabling corruption and political cronyism with no regard for fiscal oversight or attention to economic feasibility. Nevertheless, Putin's invasion, and even more so his most recent annexation of Ukrainian territory, that constitutes civilizationalist thinking taken to its extreme, complicates regional geopolitics for Xi. In contrast to Putin, who openly professes his desire to topple the current world order, Xi still sees advantage in maintaining the existing arrangement, albeit tweaked to be more accommodating to China and ensure that China for now is prima pares with the United States, and that it is able to propagate its notion of a totalitarian surveillance state that is shielded from any form of criticism. This Russian-Chinese divergence creates a double-edged sword for China. It generates geopolitical opportunity as a matter of principle, but nowhere more so than in Afghanistan and Central Asia, a region that is crucial to Chinese security, and it alters the balance of power in the Chinese-Russian relationship. At the same time, the war in Ukraine threatens to dash Putin and Xi's hopes of papering over differences in their diverging notions of a 21st century world order and presenting a seemingly unified vision. That was evident in September at a summit of the China-Russian-backed Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, that includes Central and South Asian states. Putin was forced to concede that China had questions and concerns about the Russian invasion. Putin did not spell out those questions and concerns, but what they involved is obvious. Even if Putin's justification of the invasion on the basis that Ukraine and Russia were one nation resembles in some ways China's claims to Taiwan, the war still violates China's principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of others. In contrast to Russian claims on Ukraine, China can point to endorsement of its designs for Taiwan by the international community that by and large accepted the One China policy as the basis for the establishment of relations with China. For China, the world has changed, at least to some degree, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia took itself off the map of European or Eurasian transport corridors linking China and Europe. By doing so, Russia breathed new life into moribund routes that would allow goods to travel across the Eurasian landmass without traversing Russia. It also opened the door to greater Russian connectivity with the Middle East and Southeast Asia. All of this has complicated Chinese aspirations by giving a boost to Turkish efforts to carve out a sphere of influence of its own in Central Asia and the Caucasus, potentially in competition with China, and enhancing Iran's potential geopolitical significance as China walks a tightrope in maintaining a balance in its relationships with the Islamic Republic and Saudi Arabia, while seeking to capitalize on strains in the Saudi-US relationship. US and European sanctions on Russia means that China needs to find alternative transportation routes to Europe that bypass Russia. Turkey and Iran will be key nodes in those alternatives. Already, China-EU shipments along the northern corridor, which connects China to Europe via Kazakhstan, Russia, and Belarus, have dropped by 40% since the Russian invasion began. The sanctions have not only made transportation from China to Europe more difficult, but also more expensive. At the same time, geography offers former Soviet republics leverage as China exploits opportunity to capitalize on the weakening of Russia's position in the region. While transport along the Trans-Caspian route, dubbed the Middle Corridor, may not be able to immediately fully replace the Northern Corridor, it does help reduce bottlenecks and positions it strategically for the longer term. The Middle Corridor also enhances not only the importance to China of the Central Asian and Caucasian republics, but also that of Turkey, with its close cultural ties to the Eurasian heartland. Let's expect that the patchwork will help transform the economy of Xinjiang, the Chinese troubled northwestern province that is home to brutally repressed Turkic Muslims. The Middle Corridor would connect China to Turkey via either one Central Asian state, Kazakhstan, or several, including Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and would move onwards to Georgia, Azerbaijan, the Caspian Sea, and finally Turkey. The building blocks are already in place, with the Trans-Kazakhstan Railroad and the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars line that make the Trans-Caspian the shortest and most cost-effective railway corridor between China and Europe. The newly built 826-kilometer-long Baku-Kars line connects Azerbaijan's Caspian seaport of Alat with Kars in Turkey. Moreover, the China-Kazakhstan-Uzbekistan railway project, estimated to cost around $4.5 billion, aims to connect China to Europe via Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and Turkey. In doing so, it would reduce the journey to Europe by some 900 kilometers and 8 days. Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev predicted that the railway would, quote, open new opportunities for transport corridors linking our region with markets in the Pacific Ocean area. The move will add to the widening of existing railway routes connecting east with west, Mirziyoyev said. Uzbekistan has long asserted that the railway would offer the shortest route from China to markets in the Middle East and Europe. The new railway would feed into the rail line connecting Uzbekistan to Turkmenistan's Turkmenbashi International Seaport on the Caspian Sea. From there, it can feed into the Caucasus, Turkey, and the Black Sea via the Azerbaijani port of Baku, or Iran, India, the Gulf, and East Africa through the International North-South Transportation Corridor, or INSTC, that makes use of the Iranian port of Anzali and potentially Chabahar. The Baku port agreed in July to let Turkey's Al-Bayrak Group, which has close ties to President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, manage the facility, expand its cargo handling capacity, and build a terminal for fertilizers. If successful, the corridor, a 7,200-kilometer patchwork of independently operated railroads, highways, and maritime routes that traverses Russia, Central Asia, the Caspian, Iran, and the Arabian Sea, would reduce travel time from China from 40 to 60 days to 25 to 30 days, and cut costs by 30%. In addition, its significance could be boosted by hookups with Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. Finally, the opening of Istanbul's 13.5-kilometer long Marmaray Tunnel made it the world's first underwater railway linking Beijing and London via the Bosphorus Strait. Meanwhile, China has wittingly or unwittingly fueled Saudi hopes that the kingdom can finally drive a wedge in the long-standing Chinese-Iranian relationship. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi hit all the right chords when he spoke virtually in October with his Saudi counterpart, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, at a meeting of the China-Saudi Arabia High-Level Joint Committee. Wang told bin Farhan, quote, China attaches great importance to the development of China-Saudi Arabia relations and puts Saudi Arabia at a priority position in China's overall diplomacy, its diplomacy with the Middle East region in particular. Wang's statement came amid Saudi reports, yet to be confirmed by China, of a pending visit by Xi to the kingdom before the end of the year. The Saudi reports did not mention the Chinese leader stopping in other countries, particularly Iran. The reports focus on the kingdom, and Wang's remarks boosted Saudi hopes that Beijing may abandon its balancing act between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic. Xi may not want to include Iran in his itinerary, unlike when he last traveled to the Middle East in 2016, to avoid the optics of visiting Tehran at a time of sustained anti-government protests. Even so, China's ability to remain aloof from the Middle East's myriad conflicts may be shrinking. Xi's problem is that with Ukraine shifting geopolitical realities in Eurasia, exploiting cracks in the Saudi-US relationship highlights opportunity as well as the minefield the Chinese leader has to navigate. If experience is anything to go by, Xi risks becoming the latest leader to be sucked into Middle Eastern conflicts, irrespective of whether they wanted to get involved or not. Worrisome for China, the weakening of Russian influence and the vacuum it has created in Central Asia and the Caucasus has prompted former Soviet republics to turn new realities to their advantage. Emboldened by higher oil prices and wooed by Europe, hungry for non-Russian energy, Azerbaijan attacked Armenia in September. Neither Russia, that in 2021 mediated an end to 3 weeks of fighting in the Caucasus, nor China stepped in to negotiate a ceasefire. It was left to the United States to help silence the weapons, an indication that Armenia no longer relies on Russia as a security guarantor. China and Russia's reluctance to engage in managing, if not helping resolve regional conflicts, much like China's, and to a degree Russia's approach to the Middle East, points to an Achilles heel of their policies. Both concentrate on their own narrow interests, with little regard for the interests of others. China limits itself to supporting strong regimes that welcome its Belt and Road Initiative. For example, it has made clear that Central Asians should find other venues rather than the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for solving intra-regional territorial disputes. That message was made loud and clear when the organization made no effort at its latest summit in September to put an end to clashes along the Kyrgyz-Tajik border that was just relatively a few kilometers away. In an outburst at the Central Asia-Russia Summit in Astana in October, Tajik President Emomali Rahmon had an implicit message that China should heed. Rahmon demanded Russia start treating Tajikistan with some respect, and not like some African country. The message was undergirded by an anti-Russian sentiment that shapes the mixed reception in Central Asia of Russian draft dodgers. That sentiment is fueled as much by the resentment of Russia's colonial history as it is by racism that Central Asians encounter in Russia. China may not have been a colonial power, but that same sentiment was reflected in the abstention of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan in a United Nations Human Rights Council vote on a resolution that called for an investigation of China's crackdown on ethnic Turkic Muslims, including Kazakhs, in the northwestern Chinese province of Xinjiang. Afghanistan is a good place to turn to as a prime example of the limits of Chinese capabilities and influence. China's embassy in Kabul has led Beijing's diplomatic push in Afghanistan in many ways. The embassy has helped get Taliban officials included in various regional forums. It has facilitated millions of dollars in aid from Chinese institutions. The embassy's role strokes with the Chinese Foreign Ministry emerging as a leading voice in calling for Washington to release $7 billion in frozen Afghan central bank funds. Yet, all of this positive engagement has not advanced goals China wants to achieve. China had hoped that the Taliban would form a broad based government whose inclusiveness would support regime stability, but instead, a single faction dominates the new administration. The Taliban has failed to hand over Uyghur fighters as China wanted, or even fully curtail their activities. Moreover, Taliban efforts to rein in militant groups that threaten Chinese interests by seeking to undermine the Pakistani government, such as Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan or TTP, have been limited. Even worse, the Taliban have not stopped the TTP from training Balochi separatists and other militants who target the Chinese in Pakistan. On top of that, the Taliban has disappointed China by courting India in a bid not to have to put all of its eggs in one basket. Afghanistan used to be a place where China could run joint projects with India, the US, and others. Now, instead, Afghanistan is increasingly seen through the light of great power competition as merely another place where Washington and its proxies might undermine Chinese interests. Let me interrupt here and leave the floor to Young, who is wiser than I am about China's regional dealings, and I'll come back then to add my 2 cents of wisdom. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Lars for organizing the seminar, and James, you're too kind. I just wanted to supplement the first 2 speakers with some economic details, which I believe have some strategic significance. My talk has 2 parts, short parts. One is about China's relations, economic relations with Russia and with Ukraine. That helps to understand China's role and the positions it has taken on Russia's war in Ukraine. First, China's relations with Ukraine. It is very important for China. Ukraine is relatively a small economy, and China has been the biggest trading partner for Ukraine for many years. The trade volume is very small, only 0.2%, but Ukraine supplies some strategic goods to China, especially food, that is grains. China has had domestic self-sufficiency policy in food for many years. For about 5 to 10 years ago, China tried to have at least 95% of food self-sufficiency. So if you think about that, actually, now China relies on about 19% of food imports for domestic consumption. It is a very high number. That's why the stable supply from other countries is very important, and there Ukraine plays an important role. Especially corn, barley, sunflower oil. Those grains that China imported from Ukraine is about 20% in those categories for China. So it's very important. And there is also iron ore, minerals. China has also had a lot of cooperation with Ukraine in military technology and equipment. Beyond that, China has invested in some big infrastructure projects in Ukraine. It's multi-billion dollars infrastructure projects, including the war-torn ports of Mariupol and Odessa. So it is true when China says it, apart from the humanitarian crisis and human losses, it's not something that that is good for China. But when it comes to food supply, China has some domestic strategic reserves that it started to build when many countries started to limit exports, and also with climate change and COVID. An estimation, we don't know exactly, but an estimation is that it has about 1.5 years of food supply in its national reserve. So there, it's maybe not that nervous, but even though Chinese government has instructed its state-owned enterprises to stock up and buy food in view of the war in Ukraine. So far, as Lars said, China has not recognized the independence of the occupied Ukrainian regions. But Chinese President Xi Jinping has not agreed to a direct talk with Zelensky, and China has not agreed to be a security guarantor together with some other major countries for Ukraine. The two, Ukraine and China, are not totally in line when it comes to Ukraine's role in regional security. China's official language is that Ukraine should be a bridge between the East and West, and not a front of war between major powers. But the Ukrainian foreign minister said that Ukraine is a European country by history and by the decisions of the people, and it is not a bridge that anyone can cross at will. So China's view is not echoed in Ukraine. How about China's economic relations with Russia? Apart from the political discussions, I think they are very important and fundamental reasons. If you look at economic relations, you could say that Russia is an irreplaceable economic partner for China, especially in the supply of strategic goods like energy, oil and gas. The trade volume is much bigger than China's trade with Ukraine, but China is very much more heavily reliant on imports of energy, especially oil and gas. 70% of oil and 45% of gas, China relies on imports. And there, Russia is the biggest supplier of energy and oil and gas for China. It is the second biggest source of crude oil, a little bit after Saudi Arabia, and second biggest source of coal imports after Indonesia, and second biggest pipeline gas supplier after Turkmenistan. The Power of Siberia 1 pipeline started sending gas in 2019, and last year it reached 10 billion cubic meters, and the capacity will be 38. And the two countries, because of the war, have actively started to plan. Actually, it was in January, they have agreed to look at Power of Siberia number 2, and the capacity would be a little bit, just a little bit lower than Nord Stream 1. So it would be a big diversion from Russia's gas to Europe. Not only are the volumes important, but also China regards pipeline gas and oil much more safer than oil and gas shipments, because the shipments could be, in extreme situations, the shipments could be embargoed by the US and its Western allies, and especially China, even if Chinese analysts think that even if China has good friends in Persian Gulf, in Iran, they could be blocked by the West, especially they need to travel through the Malacca Straits. So the pipelines from Russia, from Central Asia, and the shipments in Far East are regarded by China as much safer. And in terms of a strategic crisis, that is especially if something happens in the Taiwan Strait, Russia and Central Asia supplies would be very crucial for China. The war is not good for China, and it is actually also a question for China. It is not about which side China chooses, whether Ukraine or Russia. China's official stance is not to choose a side, but I have shown that Russia is much more important for China and irreplaceable. But China's stability is also much affected by this war. This year has been a very bad year in terms of economy for China. The tech war with the US, the COVID lockdown measures, and as well as Russia's war in Ukraine have dragged down China's economy significantly. In terms of supply of these strategic goods, the imports of inflation, China's stock market is affected, and when there is a great leadership consolidation process going on in China, the priority in China's domestic politics for the party leadership is economic and social stability. It has always been social stability, but this year and early next year is especially important. You can of course see strengthened political control in China. At the same time, the government is trying to stabilize economy. And this war, the sooner it ends, the better it is for China. Then it is a question how active China should be in mediating the war. Then in this context, Central Asia has become more important. Let me see. Thanks. Central Asia has become even more important in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. It has been the home to the ancient Silk Road, but it's as Lars and also James introduced, it has very important geostrategic significance, and that is already noted by countries like Turkey, Japan, South Korea, Middle Eastern countries, India. But this is the cover of a policy brief that I recently wrote, and also would like to emphasize that the importance of Central Asia is underestimated by Western governments. When I talk about Central Asia, I refer to these five STAN countries. Vast land with a lot of food production, oil and gas, and minerals, but they're also seeking change. They seek to diversify their destination of exports. They have been very heavily reliant on Russia as an export market and also migrant labor. And they also now have an opportunity to play a role between major powers if they're given the opportunity. Lars and James have mentioned about this railway, the Eurasian land bridge. Indeed, it was very important, and especially when Corona measures brought about global logistic chaos, and this new land bridge used to go through Kazakhstan and Russia, and then three ways, either through Ukraine or Lithuania or Belarus. And now, because of bad relations with Lithuania, that part has stopped. And the Ukraine part, because of war damages, only very small amount is still going on. And as James mentioned, Belarus and Russia, because of war and because of political reasons, has reduced a lot. So it is there. China is trying to build a more southern line, but this corridor remains very important. And then, if you look at energy supply and reserves in Central Asia. It's a bit, maybe a bit small, but in terms of gas reserves, Turkmenistan is ranked number 6 in the world. Number 1 is Russia, 2 is Iran, number 3 Qatar. So you can, and then Kazakhstan is number 15, and Turkmenistan is the number 3 biggest pipeline gas supplier in the world. So you can see that these days it's very interesting. I saw news yesterday that the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Donald Lu this week is visiting Central Asia, and the message there is clear. He's saying that let's find a way that so that you can sell more gas and oil to Europe. U.S. doesn't need gas. We have a lot of gas and oil, but and we understand if you want to have some normal relations with Russia, because after all you have had history and a lot of interactions with Russia, and the U.S. will not intervene so much in the political and military affairs in Central Asia. So that message is very clear that U.S. is trying to scramble for access to Central Asia. Before that, the meetings were either in the Washington or on the phone. So, but now there is increased attention to this region. When you look at oil reserves, Kazakhstan is number 12. But many on the list are either under sanctions or in unstable security conditions, like Venezuela, Iran, Libya, for example. So, you know, these gas pipelines are also very important. Also, Ukraine, uranium. Kazakhstan is by far the biggest producer of uranium, and if nuclear power becomes more accepted to combat climate change, Central Asia will play a significant role. Here is a map. You can see these. The green line is the oil pipeline, and the red line is the gas pipeline. They both were launched in 2009 to send gas or oil to China. To China's Xinjiang province, and they're also at some points are also connected. The oil line is connected to Russian oil, and China has been by far for decades the most interested and biggest buyer of Central Asian gas and oil. There were not so much alternatives for Central Asian countries. There is a planned line that go to from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan and Pakistan, but it's insecure. It's lack of funding there. There has also been a talk of a Trans-Caspian pipeline that connects Central Asia to Azerbaijan and then connects to Europe's southern corridor. But that line, that is also stagnated, mainly because of, on the European side, there is no progress on proceeding. So this week, when U.S. Assistant Secretary of State is there, he's also saying, let's investigate this possibility again of sending the gas if Central Asia states want. But the background is the Europe has seen no progress on the European side. So China is also there has been 3 lines, and then a line D is a gas line has received a boost after the war started in Ukraine. Finally, 2 minutes. One important difference so far, we could see some changes from the US side, that you can see it's becoming more flexible about the political engagement. In the past, the strategy from the Europe and US in engaging with Central Asia is either indirect, that is, we provide some aid and require democratization and liberal economic policies. And also, American analysts have mentioned that the US have probably underestimated the importance of China for Central Asian countries in terms of their economic development, and require that they re-evaluate relations with China because of ethnic issues and political issues. There have also been scandals when US had military bases in Central Asia that they left in 2014, like involving in corruption cases, or getting and didn't really help with the regional unrest. So now the U.S. wants to set up bases there again, and there is still a lot of uncertainty. Washington Consensus, just a term that broadly refers to neoliberal values that emphasizes democracy, liberal economic governance, and China is saying that we don't have these kind of strings attached, but we would like to offer Chinese wisdom in how to develop your economy, maintain social stability. And for Central Asian countries, this is an opportunity, strategic opportunity to choose their own path, but their importance is historically high. And I think that here, when we sit in Denmark and in Europe, should really seize this window to have more engagement with Central Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yang. And now we have James back, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Yang. This is perfectly set up part of what I want to say in this second bit. To recollect, Central Asia and the Caucasus in the wake of the Russian invasion are, from China's perspective, fraught with opportunities as well as pitfalls. In some cases, it's a question of the glass is half full. In others, half empty. That makes drawing up a balance of assets and liabilities difficult at times. This is most obvious with regards to Russia. A strong Russia was long in China's benefit. It created a seemingly formidable alliance opposed to US domination of the world order that was politically, economically, and potentially militarily powerful. Russia no longer is that powerful ally. Today, it is severely hampered by US and European sanctions that over time will wear it down economically. Russia has become a pariah state in Western eyes that has put a bullseye on itself by challenging the international order in a brutal fashion and proving to be not that good at it. China's reluctancy to back Russia in its challenging of international borders shouldn't come as a surprise. China has refused to recognize Russian-inspired declarations of independence in 2008 by two regions of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as well as Russia's grab of Crimea in 2014. This time round, the Ukraine war has more substantially changed the dynamics in the Chinese-Russian relationship, which on the one hand works in China's favor, and on the other creates multiple dilemmas. These dilemmas include China wanting to be supportive of Russia, while not being seen as violating its foreign and defense policy principles, or following in Russia's footsteps in fundamentally challenging the basic structure of the international order as well as international law. Nonetheless, China does not want to see Russia defeated. The poor performance of Russian weapons and other military hardware calls into question past Chinese reliance on key Russian technology and is likely to encourage China to become even more technologically self-reliant. That was already happening prior to Ukraine, with the rollout in 2017 of the fifth generation Chengdu J-20 Chinese fighter that is believed to be technologically superior to Russia's Su-57E. Add to this, not only has the Ukraine war strengthened NATO, but it has also demonstrated in battle the power and efficacy of Western weaponry. The Ukraine invasion is also likely to be the death knell for the presumed division of labor between Russia and China, whereby in broad lines, Russia focused more on security in Central Asia and the Caucasus, while China played to its economic strength with some forays into security. The breakdown is occurring as regional uncertainty rises, with a potential civil war in Afghanistan, social unrest in Kazakhstan and Western Uzbekistan, and a possible confrontation between Russia and Kazakhstan. China fears not only that Uyghur militants will use Afghanistan to foster instability in Xinjiang, it also is increasingly concerned that other adversaries might seek to use Afghanistan as a base to target China or its interests from Central and South Asia. Central Asia is critical to China, which shares almost 1,800 kilometers of borders with it. That is why the region was the starting point in 2013 for the Belt and Road Initiative, Xi's flagship foreign policy initiative. Today, China is trying to manage the region's growing uncertainty with its usual banking diplomacy playbook: throw money at the problem. It has few other options. Even so, throwing money at the problem may prove this time round easier said than done. Growth is expected to weaken in most Central Asian countries because of the region's close links with Russia. Moreover, Central Asians are likely to be more cautious about Russian security guarantees. That is particularly true for Kazakhs, whom Putin has at least twice described in similar terms to the way he looks at Ukrainians: a people that never were a people, and a state that never really existed. Much like the Gulf states, Central Asians are seeking to reduce their dependence on an external power, in this case Russia, and diversify their foreign relations. Helped by the Ukraine war, the Central Asians have so far been more successful, certainly compared to the Saudis, at not antagonizing external powers. In a sign of the times, Uzbekistan has increasingly sought to carve out a space of its own by not simply piggybacking on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Instead, Uzbekistan has framed its interests as establishing connectivity between Central and South Asia in a bid to tap markets, as well as provide the landlocked nation and its neighbors access to ports. By the same token, Turkish President Erdogan has paid a series of visits to Central Asia and the Caucasus since the beginning of this year, during which he concluded multiple agreements worth billions of dollars. In addition, Turkish drone sales have boosted the country's image after they were successfully employed by Ukraine to destroy Russian military hardware, and by Azerbaijan against Armenia in the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. China may welcome Turkey and Iran, two states opposed to US domination, making inroads in Central Asia, in the hope that to some degree they may compensate for the degrading of Russia. Similarly, an intelligence sharing agreement concluded in August between Kazakhstan and NATO member Turkey spotlighted Russia's weakened position. Kazakhstan would not have been able to sign such an agreement without severe pushback from Moscow prior to the war. The intelligence sharing agreement tells China that increased Russian and Iranian influence in Central Asia may not always run parallel with Chinese interests. At the same time, Turkey's regional defense alliance, the Central Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, has been undermined. CSTO intervened in Kazakhstan in January to restore law and order amid anti-government protests, a month before the Ukraine invasion. 6 months later, it failed to respond to requests by Armenia in renewed fighting with Azerbaijan. In September, Kyrgyzstan pulled out of joint CSTO military exercises after the power vacuum in Central Asia enabled border clashes with Tajikistan. Last month, Kyrgyzstan, home to a Russian military base, rejected a demand that it expel the Ukrainian ambassador. US and European sanctions against Russia and a brief suspension in July of oil flowing through a Kazakh pipeline that traverses Russia spotlighted Kazakhstan's need to create alternative export routes and diversify economic relations. In fact, the diversification is proving to be an engine for foreign investment, including from China. Russia's weakened position has also thrown out the window the unspoken division of labor, whereby Russia shouldered responsibility for security in Central Asia, while China focused on economics. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, has advised his interlocutors in Central Asia that going forward, Chinese private military companies would play a greater role in securing Belt and Road related strategic infrastructure projects. Some analysts suggested that the Chinese companies could also be employed to train Central Asian militaries, a domain that was until now largely a Russian preserve. Altered perceptions of Russian military capabilities effectively means that China will face security challenges across the greater Middle East, a swath of land that stretches from the Gulf to the Chinese border. In Central Asia, the problem is Russia. In the Gulf, it is the question of how long China will feel that it can rely on the US defense umbrella to secure the flow of energy and much of its trade against the backdrop of a reconfigured US regional commitment and increasingly strained relations between Washington and Beijing. Ironically, the Middle East is perhaps the one region where concepts of parallel cooperation and competition may work amid fading hopes for a revival of the 2015 international agreement that curbed Iran's nuclear program. The failure to salvage the agreement potentially puts one more nail in the coffin of a regional security architecture that would excludes rather than includes the Islamic Republic. Mitigating in favor of a firmer grounding of the reduction of regional tension is the fact that it is driven not only by economic factors such as diversification and rationalization in the Gulf and the economic crises in Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, but also by big power geopolitics. China and Russia made clear prior to the Ukraine war that they would entertain possible greater engagement in Middle Eastern security if regional players take greater responsibility for managing regional conflicts, reducing tensions, and their own defense. Rhetoric aside, that is not different from what the United States, the provider of the Middle East security umbrella, is looking for in its attempts to rejigger its commitment to security in the Gulf. In addition to the emerging, albeit tentative, unspoken, macro-level big power consensus on a more inclusive multilateral approach, efforts by the major regional powers, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Israel, and Iran, except for as it regards ties between the Jewish state and the Islamic Republic, to reduce tensions and put relations on a more even keel, contribute to an environment potentially conducive to discussion of a more broad-based security architecture. The need to focus on conflict prevention and improved communication between regional rivals, alongside more robust defense cooperation, is evident irrespective of whether the Iran nuclear accord is brought back from the dead, given that the covert war between Israel and Iran will continue no matter what happens. Even so, the Biden administration remains focused on broadening responsibility for a regional security architecture that targets Iran rather than an inclusive structure that would give all parties a stake, seek to address root problems, and stymie an evolving arms race. This means that all in all, Xi's decision to pick Central Asia for his first foreign trip since the pandemic began, and likely visit to Saudi Arabia before the end of the year, reflects China's confidence that that it is already the ascendant power in both constituent parts of the greater Middle East. In Kazakhstan in September, Xi pledged to support Kazakhstan's territorial integrity, a veiled warning to Putin not to act on his past statements that Kazakhstan, like Ukraine, never was a state. China's ascendancy does not mean that it can rely on its economic heft and draw red lines. Particularly as a result of the vacuum created by the Ukraine war, China also has to broaden its palette of soft power tools. As a result, Chinese embassies in the region are focusing on local civil society organizations, a segment of society they had long ignored. The embassy's generous donations, mirroring long-standing Western support for non-governmental organizations, aim to engender bottom-up normative change in China's favor. China has also expanded its media outreach by offering content in local languages that is often published and or broadcast through state-controlled Central Asian media outlets. Furthermore, China is increasingly enlisting online influencers who echo China's party-state narratives. The impact of China's media strategy is magnified by the degree of state control of media in some countries and the independent media's lack of resources in others. Nevertheless, the going for China has not always been easy. For example, Kyrgyz media, academia, and youth organizations have proven successful in efforts to fend off Chinese influencing operations. Independent Kyrgyz media frequently counter Chinese narratives with alternative views and often focus on involvement in corruption of Chinese companies and aligned local politicians. Kyrgyzstan, which has a 1,000-kilometer-long border with Xinjiang, is a particular target of Chinese influencing operations that include an effort to put a Chinese language teacher in every Kyrgyz primary school. Efforts to stymie Chinese influencing operations have been boosted by Central Asian states seeking, in the wake of the Russian invasion, to hedge their bets, balance relations with major powers, and leverage their positions as potential keynotes in Eurasian transportation corridors that bypass Russia. One example of hedging bets is Uzbekistan, that has sought to carve out a space of its own by not simply piggybacking on China's Belt and Road initiative. The Ukraine invasion has also increased the leverage of countries like Turkey and Iran that have deep cultural ties to the region, and like the Central Asians, are key to alternative transportation routes to step up efforts to carve out niches of influence of their own, even if they can't compete with China's economic heft. In addition to all of this, Turkish drone sales have boosted the country's image after they were successfully employed by Ukraine to destroy Russian military hardware and by Azerbaijan against Armenia in 2020. China may welcome Turkey and Iran, two states opposed to US domination, but to some degree, they may also compensate for a weakened, to some degree, Turkey and Iran will help China also compensate for a weakened Russia. Thank you very much. I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this fantastic overview and sharp analysis, and also for your presentations. It was very useful. Now we have time for some few questions, and please feel free. While you pose your question, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew. I work for Morningstar. We're a financial investment company, but I worked with the United Nations for 10 years in Central Asia mostly. So I've been there about 25 times since 2005. I speak Russian and I speak Tajik. I'm basically going to, first of all, applaud kind of Yang's comments. I think she painted a very fair representation of what's happening in Central Asia. And of course, I guess China's importance there. I'm going to also very much applaud Lars's comments of just kind of looking at the kind of comparing the two sides. It was a very much a good focus, especially on the focusing on the connectivity of China's approach. I'm going to use just kind of a few moments to really clarify and maybe give a bit of agency to Central Asia based on James's comments. James, there's a lot of what you said, I have to say, doesn't actually reflect what's happening in the country. And I'm going to say this just because we're all kind of intellectuals here, and I think everybody should be able to have a different perspective from the other side. I think it's extremely important. I've spent about 4 months this year in Afghanistan, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, and I was just in India and Pakistan. I was also in Karakol, Pakistan, and I do this pretty much every year for several years. This isn't a battle between China and Russia by any means. There's from the investment perspective, it has never been a more conducive environment. So you have almost every country in the world that has money is looked to Central Asia. There is events happening. I'm just going to mention a few. September 9th. No. I'm sorry. You need to know this thing. September 19th, in the United States, in New York City, you had the president of Kazakhstan, had 40 American companies around the table talking to him about investment. What this says is you have the West extremely interested and available in Central Asia, more than they've ever been before. They've taken away the security perspective, and the Chinese are indeed coming in. Russia is also there. You also have, very important, about 250,000 Russians who've gone into Kazakhstan, and they're there at the behest and the benefit of the Central Asian countries and vice versa. The question is, and I'm going to ask you this, is how contemporary is your thinking in a region which is pretty much moving month by month? Everything that you were just saying, especially regarding the transport corridors, the southern transport corridor to the west, the Caspian Sea reference, the rail travel going to Russia, how often are you updating your thinking for a region which requires updated thinking every quarter, James? Because you're such a prominent voice, we need to know this.
Matthew, thank you for the comment and for the criticism. Let me just, before I answer your last question directly, let me just make clear, I was not saying that the Russians and the Chinese by definition are competing, nor was I saying that there is investment, that there is no Western investment going in. Of course there is. What I was saying is that the dynamic and the balance of power in the Chinese-Russian relationship has changed. And I think that's very much contemporary rather than historic. Now, with regard to, just to be clear on what you called updating, I have been covering Central Asia. The first time I went there was in the 1980s. And I've been covering it based in Istanbul for a fair number of years in the initial phase after the fall of the Soviet Union. I travel there regularly. Obviously, in the last 2 years, that's been less so, or not at all. But I do travel there regularly, and I maintain very close contacts with a large number of people. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't know that what you are saying and what I are saying are fundamentally different. I think that, I was looking at this in broader geopolitical strokes. I think what is true is, and Young pointed that out, both in terms of the United States and Europe, that while there is economic engagement, there has been, for a relatively long period of time, geopolitical neglect. And that's something that which I think, and Young has said that very clearly, the Americans and the Europeans need to rethink. Now, having said that, there is already a move with, as you probably well know, with potential European investment in the Tajik Dam. So I think that realization is starting to break through, but time will tell. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. Do we have other questions? It doesn't look like that. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, if there are no questions, I think I will just conclude. Right? You have any comments?
Yeah, I think Central Asia is a relatively new topic of interest and also research area. It's really recently got much more attention. So I think it's really good that we started to have such kind of events and talk about it.
Yes, I totally agree. Let me, when I introduced James, I forgot one thing, and now I will just mention that you have a blog post not every day, I think, but almost every day you have an article on some very interesting topic, and I would recommend you to look it up. It's called The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer, but it's not on soccer, it's on different kind of analysis in Central Asia, in the Islamic world, in the Middle East. So look it up and feel free to read it. It's pretty good. And with these words, I thank you for taking time to talk with us and to talk to us, James, to Young, and to you for coming here today and be together with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.